So many people get into a crisis. And I'm not just talking about the current coronavirus, but crisis in general. So many people spend time fighting things that are changing because they don't want it to change. And they spend all their time doing that. But the real essence is to accept the things we can't change and focus on the things that we can change. That's really the very, very first step. Of course, in any situation, it's always defining where you want to go, what the outcome is, and working your way back and thinking, how do I create value for other people? That's really the essence of managing crisis. And then the other thing really is to look inside yourself, okay? And remember that we have to separate our self-worth from our accomplishments. So no matter what happens in a crisis, we have to do the best we can do, and it doesn't measure us as good or bad. Okay, we just have to really be focused on what's ahead of us and how we create value for others.
Yeah, and I would also say, time plays such an important role. Crisis can be turned into great things and catalysts, but like that doesn't mean that it's enjoyable while it's happening. And so the things that I think can seem so horrific in the moment, and whether it's on a personal or societal level, can also end up being those things that really are a catalyst to huge growth. And so when we have aspects of ourselves or aspects of our businesses or organizations that are kind of really firmly held together, crisis can be that destabilizing force that allows a huge amount of change. And so when we look at human development, discomfort, confusion, all those things that are just really not fun in the moment are actually the very things that allow us to grow. And so that kind of really huge growth. When I was a kid, I shot up really quickly, and I used to have to sleep with ice bags on my ankles. That's not fun, but I grew super quickly. And so I think oftentimes looking at the tools that help us when we're in moments of crisis, if we can't shed those tools and use something different when we're out of that crisis, the thing that helps us in one moment can actually be the thing that harms us in another, whether it's our personal life, our business, our society.
What we have to also understand, Boris, is that crisis is inevitable. Mm-hmm. So the question is, will it catapult our growth or will it hold us back? We all will continue to go through crises in life, whether it's personal, business, health. So how we deal with crisis really is an integral part of our happiness and our success as we go forward. Just to think we get through one crisis and we're done, it doesn't work that way. And as most of us know, crisis is much nicer looking back on than going through it. Sure. But we still need to be very mindful and do the best we can do.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And so one of the things that you mentioned now, and that is very integral and is one of the pillars of the book and the discussion there, is the separation of happiness, the separation of success. We have a lot of assertive, high-achieving individuals in our community on this call. I'm talking to two now. I think I am. How do you folks think about those things? How do you come to separate them? How was your journey of experiencing them differently and defining those things, happiness and success, for you, and thinking of those as the pillars to consider, include in the book, include in your teachings?
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Well, so I think it's really looking at, like, where do we look for our self-worth? And when we look at the field of psychology, one of the ways that it can be described is when you talk about passion, right? Because while we're not just ambitious people, we're pretty passionate in how we approach that. And there's kind of two ideas of it. And one is obsessive passion, that thing where, we can't pull ourselves out of it. We're completely consumed by our passion. And it's very easy to think like, oh, well, that's the sacrifice that has to happen to really get us to where we want to go. But what we find is with that type of approach to things, when we place our self-worth inside of what we're doing, our productivity, our passion, it's really giving our power away, because inevitably we're not going to do that forever. If we're lucky enough to live long enough, eventually you run a business, you eventually step away from that business. And if our entire sense of self-worth is placed in what we're producing, we can be the most successful person in the world. And when we step away from that and we lose that sense of self, there's a huge void that's there. But also along the way, it really kind of takes that power away because we're putting it in something else, versus something that the researchers call harmonious passion, which is that idea that you can put your all into something, really chase it super hard, but you have these other aspects of life that fill you, that you say, okay, I'm going to find self-worth through my family, through myself, through my meditation practice, through these other little things. So it's almost like diversifying our portfolio of self-worth. It doesn't mean we don't get some gratification from that, but really making sure that we develop out different parts of our life, which allows us to, I think, have a more enjoyable life, but also creates a sturdier sense of self for when things, go completely wrong in our businesses and our organizations, so that we're really focusing on that issue, and we're not focusing on the second issue of, oh, well, if I'm a failure, what does this mean for me personally, this or that? Like, that's going to be there. But if we have all of our worth there, it makes it much worse, and actually makes it harder to navigate the crises, which he had no shortage of.
Yeah. Well, I think, everyone on this call is at a different point in the journey of life. Okay. Whether you're starting out in business or you've done business for 35 years and mentor other people. And I think the real secret is how we go from success to significance. So remember, success is what we create for ourselves. Until we have that, it's really hard to do others. But once we create that, the real joy in life is significance, I say, is what we create for other people. So the real issue is, how do we get out of the type A work, work, work? How do we separate ourselves? And the real key is learning to love ourselves. If we can fall in love with ourselves and really love who we are, accept the things we can't change, who we are, try and be better. But once we really truly love ourselves, then no matter what happens, we do the best we can do. And whether we get knocked down, get up again, most successful entrepreneurs failed several times. Or I shouldn't say failed, we're defeated several times. Defeat is when you get knocked down, failure is when you don't get up. So as long as you keep plugging along. So I think the real key is that we really need to learn to love ourselves, do the best we can do, and then accept whatever happens to us as a learning lesson. I believe bad things happen to me because I have lessons to learn. And once I learn those, they stop and other bad things happen. I mean, it's a series of life.
Well, and he says separate from the work, work, work and get all of this, but I can sort of vouch from having lived with him for 18 plus years. It's not like he worked less to do that. The hours that he worked were pretty wild. And so it's not a practice that you have to stop the type A intense lifestyle to do. It is something that can be brought in alongside it.
And how did that work? How did bringing it alongside, how did it develop? How did it come to actually exist?
I'm very blessed. I have a wonderful wife of 35 years. Charlie has a wonderful brother and younger sister. So I have a really good family life. So, but I've always had this attitude of competitive nature, to do the best I can do. And you get up next day and do it again. And so, I would tell you I was successful because I hired smart people who learned fast. Okay, I can't take the credit for it. I also had mother and father, sister and brother. My first business was all family. But it really is about creating a team, working together, and creating value for other people. I love to create value for customers. Okay, and that's, I put the customers at the center of the universe, and I work back from there.
But I think when we talk about, how do you develop the sense of self as you're, the train is going, you're not stopping it to doing it, to develop that. Some examples from when my dad, from our book, when he was running these businesses and everything was absolutely failing. And there was questions about, whether we would be able to keep the house, this or that. It really came down to, in that sense, adjusting expectations. And so he had this piece of, he would show up to work and work his butt off and really struggle on that sense. But he also recalibrated and said, okay, if I can get up every day and take a run on the beach and see the waves crash and come back to my family, that is success. Everything can be falling around me, but if I can have that, that's success. And he hadn't studied psychology, but we also look at the nature of hope, and something that's so key in that is being able to recalibrate our expectations. Accept the things that you can't change kind of plays into that, but looking at where can I find small measures of success to find those little wins, to kind of build myself up along the way. And we're also both, longtime meditators. Well, him since before I was alive, so he gets a little bit more credit than me on that. But really looking at like, what are the things that I can connect with myself that don't have anything to do with the productivity of my company or that piece of the world. And counterintuitively, that can actually be something that really strengthens us in how we show up to our work.
And the final thing, and we'll go on to the next question, is I think two key things to really help us separate self-worth and achievement is gratitude and forgiveness. I mean, I have a gratitude practice. Everyone has something to be grateful. There are more people out there with more than they thought to me. So the real issue is when things get bad, not just look at what's going wrong, but take a look at what we're grateful for. And then in the areas where people hurt us or other things happen, forgiveness is a self-blessing. Okay, it relieves stress from ourselves. So those are the things that I think really help.
That's great, and that's helpful to know. Thank you. In terms of before the stress is relieved, the stressful moments, I know each of you have had so many so far that you've been able to overcome successfully, and you use to help people understand how they might be able to deal with them. Can each of you please share about some of the crises that you thought, wow, this one is really going to undo me? I'm probably done, but you were able to come back from it. So it would be great to have those examples and also how you were able to deal with them.
Well, firstly, the book is a series of crises. Mm-hmm. So I thought I was writing a book about happiness and success, but Charlie kept saying, Dad, I don't want to know what happened, but tell me what you thought, what you felt, what you said. So she tried to get to the hardest moments of my life, okay? And talk about how did I keep my emotional stability through crisis.
So what's one of those moments?
So I guess probably the most difficult moment I had was when Charlie was 6 months old. Her brother was 3.5. We had the SafeSkin latex gloves. So we started manufacturing gloves in Malaysia. And we had taken all the money from the Coca-Cola deal for the entire family, put it in, and we're broke. We had no money left. In October of 1990, I got foreclosure notices and personal guarantees being called in Malaysia. We couldn't pay our bills. And though I knew it was hard, I didn't realize it was that point. My wife, who was just wonderful, said, honey, don't worry, I'll go back to work. And I said, honey, you can make 60, 70 grand as a registered dietitian. I owe $10 million. Why don't you take care of the kids and let me figure my way out of this? And so I started thinking, who can help me? And I think one of the lessons I've learned from working with Charlie that she taught me is that asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. And she pointed out to me that every single crisis I got out of, I got help from other people. When I relied on myself, I only had my own thoughts. But when I was able to reach out to other people, so basically what happened in this instance is I reached out to my YPO organization. I called up to somebody in Malaysia. They introduced me to somebody else. I got to the chairman. They got to the chairman of the bank. They gave us 30 days. We got an extra 30 days to pay the bills. We found another bank to take over. And then we just got lucky that there was some publication. Medical Laboratory Observer had done a study on gloves, and SafeSkin significantly and consistently outperformed the others. So I just took that article, went to every customer who turned me down, and just through personal perseverance, converted one to the next, and it kind of turned around. It was also good that the glut of gloves was going away, and we were able to turn it around. And 2.5 years later, we took it public, and then in 2000 sold it to Kimberly-Clark. So, but it was never giving up. It was asking for help, okay, and it was just living one day at a time and trying to put one foot in front of the other.
That makes sense. And if as listening to this and processing this, what I'm hearing is being open to ask for help, being able to think there's got to be other options. There's got to be other ways to solve the issue. It sounds like relationships you've nurtured over the years, you were able to call on those relationships and try to find other opportunities, other angles, and then working extremely hard and perseverance so it sounds like those three things and a bunch of others collectively.
Sure, but it's not being open to, it's pursuing help from others. Because the difference between experience and inexperience is the number of choices we have. So if we rely on ourselves, we only have a couple choices. If we open it up to other people, we then see other choices we wouldn't otherwise see.
Right, makes sense. Charlie, how about you?
Yeah, well, so there's been plenty of crisis in different arenas, but I would say, you know, the one that stands out is probably the most intense is I had been sort of near death ill when I was 20. Had been a rugby player, which is not what people oftentimes guess when they look at me. But I had a bad rugby accident and developed some complications that essentially are very, very similar to what severe COVID looks like the same exact complications. And so for me, being in an instance of not only extreme pain and discomfort, but also in a situation where no one else was going to be able to help me. I had the best doctors in the world and no one else could do anything. And you don't have to be lying in a hospital bed to have that feeling of, oh, like I'm going to have to be my own rescue. No one else is coming. Like, it's important to ask for help, but sometimes there are those moments where we just have to do our own saving. And so for that, you know, I think I find myself almost like very lucky of in the most, I would say kind of like violent and dangerous moments was just really having that focus where everything else disappeared. And really, you know, when we look at, I work with a lot of people who experience suicidal thoughts. And so there's something that's very negative. There's many negative things, but one really negative, challenging thing that they experience is what we call cognitive constriction, where it's this tunnel vision, where it's sort of like this, there's no other way out. This is the only thing. And obviously that's
and
only-
it just builds upon itself, I would assume.
Yes. And so that's a very negative, dangerous version of it. And I work with people to help expand that. But there's almost like a positive version of that we can experience, that I experienced there, where I had this tunnel vision where everything else fell away. And for me, because it was the issue was breathing, is I was just focusing on getting through that. And so that idea of when we're in really desperate crises, leaning into tunnel vision can actually, in the most extreme moment, be really helpful. Now, mind you, outside that moment, that thing that helped me stay alive made it very challenging to operate if I couldn't let go of it. And so for me, having developed post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the tools that helped me survive something really hard then completely worked against me when I was trying to reacclimate and get out into the world. And so I also think that's not only limited to something like a health experience. When any type of crisis we're working with, some of the tools that are most useful and we apply in that moment, if we don't know how to let go of them, they'll actually continue to tear us down and destroy us. So being able to have that nuance or recognition or really self-awareness to say, okay, these instincts worked great here, they're not helping me here, how do I let go of them? And sometimes the answer is I need some help, whether it's in a business setting or in a personal setting.
Hey, Boris, let me go back. One other really critical thing that is common in all of the crises I went through that helped me get through it is to try and keep my mind in the present. The biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems in crisis, is fear. And fear is the false expectation of actual results in the future. So we make stories up and our mind goes into the future. So in a business setting, what I really needed to do is I had to stay in the present and keep my mind saying, what can I do here? Take one step at a time. I can look at the light in the tunnel and hope it's not a freight train coming, but see where I'm going. But really is to block out that fear. And it's not easy, and it doesn't happen. I mean, I was very scared, full of fear, things like that. But what helped me most, as Charlie said, is running on the beach, doing small steps to be successful, but trying to keep my mind in the present, accepting things I couldn't change, and doing the things, once I defined the outcome, I would ask myself, is this decision getting me closer or further away from where I want to go? And try and stay in the present.
And I would also say sort of like the flip side of that coin is I absolutely agree, like stay like
in the business.
Right, and the focus that you're talking about, the reverse, the positive use of the tunnel vision and the kind of focus that Richard is talking about, so that they parallel in terms of psychological time and and true focus on solving the matter. And Charlie, what were you going to say?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, so bring yourself into the present to try and decrease that fear. But as my dad had brought up, it's not going to go away. So what do we do with it? And so I think, fear is a horrible master, but it's an incredible servant. And so trying to bring ourselves into the present, decrease that fear, but then how do we use that? How do we use that fear as a motivator to help push us through the moments that we would rather just give up through? So really being able, whether it's fear or other unpleasant emotions, looking at how do I develop a relationship with it? How do I try and minimize it? But also, how do I harness it? How can I use it to serve me?
That makes sense, and that's a very, very interesting concept. So that's great. Certainly from the psychological perspective, biological perspective, we have cortisol, we have endorphins, we have different hormones that we produce, and they make us more or less able to do certain things, right? So like you're saying, put some fear into yourself, get it done, right? And so the question that came up was around fundamental changes in personal or professional life strategy. So when someone is considering a pivot, a life pivot, a career pivot, what kind of active steps would you suggest one take? So if the crisis demands changing in terms of fundamental life direction, how do you keep transforming, and how do you emerge out resilient?
Yeah, I think the first step is really to identify with the change situation, where do you want to go? Everything I do starts from the customer and works back. Many people, engineers especially, will design out from a technology out to a customer, but I'm just a customer advocate. So I love to go out there on a business side, we're talking, okay? And a personal side is, what do you want to do? Who do you want to please? Okay, what's your criteria? And then, what are the choices you have? Okay, you have to learn, you have to change. So, the question always comes up, when do you persist and when do you pivot, right? That's what you really ask. That's what Charlie asked me in the middle of the book, and I've still been thinking about it as we talk today. So the issue is, I think, from a personal is, again, accept things you can't change. Look at what is changing and say, how do I create value for others? What can I do, okay, that I can get passionate about, that I can follow? And if I can't find a passion myself, how do I find somebody else with a passion that has similar values that I can go work with and follow? So it's not an easy answer. We go through life. There's multiple pivots usually at this point, and we need to see what's important to us. What's our criteria? Is it family? Is it time? Is it business? Is it financial? So once we determine what the criteria is for wanting to change, then we have to take a look at what are the alternatives. And the rest of it goes into you connecting with people. I mean, most change happens because you meet somebody that influences you in one way or another. So it's really about building connections. I love the line that says, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So it really is a go out there and connecting with other people and seeing where it leads you. Sure.
Yeah, and I would say, obviously, when we talk about changing strategy, life strategy, business strategy, there's a wide array of examples of what that could be. But one really helpful thing, oftentimes when we're looking at this, sometimes there can be the instinct of being like, okay, well, I need to try something completely new and different, completely unrelated to anything I've ever done. And sometimes that can be good to try out, but oftentimes if we're trying to take something completely external and bring it in and apply it, that can actually fail. One thing that's really helpful, both in terms of organizations and people, is what we call kind of building on the good, right? So when we look at on a personal level, if you look at everything that you do in your life, personal, professional, whatever it is, what are the things that make me most energized, that make me come most alive? And for some people, it could be like, oh, I just feel completely empty. I feel like there's nothing that does that. And that's a time where it's really great to go out and try different things. But on a personal level, building on those things that tend to energize us and exploring, okay, that's a pointer. How can I follow that down to see if that can lead to something? And I would say when we look at organizations and societies as well, even in places where things are dysfunctional and not working well, usually there's little pockets of things that are doing well within an organization or within a society, or little pockets where it's just of everything on the table, sort of the best, so to speak, the one that works the best. And so rather than just bringing in something completely separate, looking at like, how do we build and grow on that? And so taking what's good within us and growing is I would say a really helpful one.
It goes to find a passion and follow it. It doesn't make a difference how big or how small. If it's a business pivot you're trying to make, find passion in your personal life, with friends, with causes.
Yeah, I mean, I would just as an example, because I know we can get a little abstract. For me, I'd worked in Silicon Valley. My life was very, very different than suicide prevention and psychology and storytelling. And for me, it really, so much of this did come through, oh, wow, I really notice I love helping and supporting people. And that kind of helped lead me in that direction, and stumbling into volunteering in suicide prevention work, and really just being like, I'm going to try these different things, put feelers out. I tried a lot of different things that's not this. But I never imagined that I would be making TV around something that's so important to me. And I wouldn't have
and the universe, the world, it's critical in the world today.
And so I totally support my dad when he says, start from the outcome and work your way back. But in my case also, I didn't know what that outcome was. And so being able to build on the good helped me move in the right direction when I didn't know where that direction was.
And just to clarify, when I say work from the outcome back, if you've had something you always wanted to try, you've had a passion, you just haven't had the time, the guts, or whatever to do it, then that's the time to try it, as Charlie says. Yeah. If not, start from here and build out there. But no matter what, life is too short not to love what you do and who you do with.
And and Rahana, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Yeah, just added in on the chat that I think was really helpful, of saying, being creative can be reading, writing, talking, self videos, podcasts, art, philanthropic acts. I think there's so many different opportunities. So I appreciate you jumping in and adding that.
Yeah, that's fabulous. In terms of business, in terms of business strategy, and in terms of life goals, so there could be a goal, there could be an evolution, there could be a process. How does one stay ahead of the storm? How does one anticipate crisis? How does one deal with them perhaps before they happen? Do you have any perspectives from the field of psychology, from business, from your specific experiences?
Well, yeah, I would say that the quote that we use in the book, and I will say it's a little embarrassing. I'm not the biggest sports person, which I think is, a little sad for my dad.
That's sad. But I have a son.
But yeah, the quote that we use in the book is "skate to where the puck is going to be."
Yes.
Wayne Gretzky, when they asked him, the greatest hockey player ever, in the locker room, a sportscaster said to him, "Wayne, you're not very big, you don't skate very fast, and you don't have a hard slap shot. How can you possibly be the best hockey player that ever lived?" And his modest way is, I don't know. I just skate to where the puck is going to be. And that's so true in business. Okay, so the critical thing in business is find out what the customers are going to need, products and services they're going to need in the future, okay, and then provide it to them, even before they know it. One of the things I like to do, Boris, and everybody else, is when I go into a very difficult customer, a big customer, I always have one question I'd love to ask them. I say, what would you like to do today that you can't, that would have the biggest impact? And they always say, on my life or on the business. I say, both. Tell me personally about your life first, and then tell me your business. And oftentimes, the hardest people in the world won't even know what, will start telling you about their mothers dying. They tell you all sorts of stories that open them up. And then they tell us on their business what their biggest need is. Now, we couldn't always satisfy it, but I will tell you, we then knew what was important to them. And in one instance, there was a Pittsburgh hospital, and the gal told me she needed to move gloves from one floor to another. She had an inventory, she didn't have in the right place. So I connected her with somebody who had carts to move things around. Long story short, 3-4 months later, she calls me, brings me in, and said, that person really helped. Thank you. How much of my business do you want? And gave us our business. So helping other people by knowing what they need, identifying future needs by asking customers, starting from the customer and work your way back. That's how you really build successful things.
Yeah. And on that point, I think it's very easy to be like, okay, well, I'll ask them what they want. But what people want
is also, know what they want.
Exactly.
But what they need, they know what they need.
Well, and so identifying kind of where pain points are, because if a little quote that we use in the book is if Henry Ford had asked his customers what they needed, they would have said a faster horse. And so he didn't go on what they wanted and said they needed. He built them a car. And so I think really being able to look at where are the pain points, being able to listen and take in what people are saying, but then being able to go a level deeper and go beneath that to really be able to innovate on that and not just fulfill where their expectations are, but to go beyond them.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And sometimes when maybe that is not working, as an example of addressing a particular need, or the particular goal that was set no longer seems achievable, we have a question talking about how do you pivot rather than persist? What would constitute a pivot? Was there ever a difficult decision to pivot at some time in your lives, in your careers, and why did you end up deciding to take it?
Well, there's several questions you pose there. So let me sort of break that apart. So I think that, even pivoting is persisting. I think you persist in a different manner. You continue to try different things. But I think if you don't have the a business, or you try to pivot personally, then look around and see, what do you and your friends need? What do your relatives need? So again, I think all of the pivoting starts with creating value. Okay, where do you like to volunteer? But what do other people need? Okay, it's not about me, it's about them. And I'm a big believer in the universal belief that givers gain. You give in one place and it comes back somewhere else. And I think we've been blessed because we've given, but it's come back in many ways. So find places to give. In life, you get what you give. If you want trust, you give trust. If you want love, you give love. If you want money, you give money. So really look around yourself and say, what can I give? Everybody has something to give. What can I give? What do others need? And then start from there and let it build out. And then connect with people, and life will take you wherever it takes you.
Yeah, and I would say, in terms of figuring out those really big, hard decisions, one of the things that I practice that I got to learn from my dad, and that is really true in his experience too, is experience might be the greatest teacher. We can't get that overnight, but we can reach out for help to people who have those deeper experiences in a lot of those places. And so being able to develop those mentorships, or even to just reach out cold to different people who have some sort of insight that can be helpful to help you make that decision. Because at the end of the day, we can follow our intuition, we can gain, look and do all the research we want, right, but nothing is quite like experience and having gone through those tough decisions. And so being able to call on that and use that and really get a good set of advisors in is huge.
Certainly strikes a good chord and makes sense. And from my perspective, a wonderful philosophy and an approach. Wondering, in the context of one of the questions that came up, where does your faith fit into your approach and philosophy?
Yeah, do you want to start?
You're good.
Okay. Well, so I would say, so for me, faith has changed and morphed quite a bit throughout my journey. And I do recognize that me being, relatively young, saying my journey can sound a little funny, but I think what it can really come back to is not, I found that when people had said to me after my hardest moments, like, oh, it was meant to be, like, I didn't find that as helpful, because when you're down, for some people it's great. For me, it was really tough. But for me, it was really that belief of connecting deep into myself and having that feeling of something greater. So some people call it God, some people call it divinity, universe, whatever it is. But I think really being able to disconnect from the noise or that everyday piece and recognize, okay, there's so much struggle, there's so much challenge, and also there's this sort of untouchable, really beautiful sense of ease and peace that exists there. I might not be able to feel it, I might not be able to see it, but it's there. And so for me, things like meditation, things like spirituality, that kind of help take me out of the intensity of the moment and take that kind of longer term view, allow me to I would say soften into the more challenging moments and find connection. I think at the core of that, for me, it was really connection, because it can feel super isolating. In going through business challenges, for me, definitely through mental health, even the people around me who love me, who really wanted to help me, who weren't really able to, I think being able to lean into a connection with spirituality gave me a sense of connection where I couldn't find it anyplace else. And that to me is invaluable.
That makes sense.
I think for me, Boris, I've been meditating for almost 50 years. Okay. So that's always been a very special place for me. I think the other thing is, I believe it's important to realize there is a higher force, whatever you call it, as Charlie said, but I'm not the center of the universe. There, and so
my mom might say that he feels something different.
but there is something greater than me. So the world does not revolve around me. Okay, I'm not the main player in my own life. Okay, there's others around. So the issue is meditation. Poetry has been a great. I started writing, 40 plus years ago, and as I wrote the book, as I went through life, just the expression, some of the poems as I write them, I feel like I'm just a vessel, and the words come through me from some higher force. So I've been blessed to experience. I played, collegiate athletics, been in the zone. Okay, so there are times where we are not our ego, and so for me, I've been very blessed, and try and disconnect, do the best I can, be the best I can be, but realize that there's more to life than just fulfilling my ego and being the best.
And I think like that idea that it can be different for everyone. I know I know people who are like, my spirituality is surfing or hiking. That idea of being able to separate from ourselves can always be something different, and that it gets to be different for everyone, but also that motivation to looking at like, how can I treat everyone, treat everyone well, and see if you call, again, whether you call it divinity or anything else, being able to see that in other people and show up to other people in that sense. When we're in conflict, especially, you can be furious and still see the divinity in someone at the same time. So it kind of, again, takes our ego out and is a big grounding.
And the other important thing, I think, Boris, is in having faith is, whether you call it God or whatever, is that I believe that the higher being is there to comfort us. There's nobody pulling a string. When bad things happen to us, they don't cause it, okay? But they're there to comfort our hearts, to solace, to give us solace in those hard moments, okay? That they don't create, that I do believe in fate, but it's not caused by them, okay? It's for me to learn things, and my faith is there to support me in my hardest moments.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And in terms of the hardest moments, we talked about some of them. We talked about focusing in. We talked about honing fear. We have a question as a follow-up on that regarding risk and threat assessment and dealing with fear. When do you hone fear? When do you make it your servant? When do you completely toss it aside? And as Chris Hadfield said, and this is from the question itself, that Chris said, Mr. Hadfield said, astronauts have no fear of outer space because it's just a challenge in risk reduction and threat assessments combined with preparation for the worst. Do you have any comments on that? And when to eliminate fear and how to eliminate it?
Well, I think that I think at certain times we don't necessarily have that choice, right? We can say this is a perfect time to eliminate the fear, and we can do the right steps, but I think also recognizing like we don't always have that sense of control. So even if it's a great time to do it, we put that effort in and it doesn't always happen. But I don't think those two are separate. Like I think we can really focus on eliminating fear and still use it as a servant at the same time. I would say from my experience, bringing it down into a kind of grounded story, I deal with risk a lot. Working with suicidal people, it's a very important thing. And so when we look at that example, on the outside, if we're not familiar with it, everything can seem like it's an absolute emergency and fear should be the absolute kind of key in this, that someone could die. But when we familiarize ourselves with it and really understand it, that's when we know how to ask the questions to be like, okay, well, our conversations start with risk assessments, and being able to glean out information can kind of guide us in terms of, okay, now we step in this way. We're really worried and scared. We need this to kind of go this way. Now we actually can have more space for someone to work with this. And so I don't think that's only applicable when we're working with people who are suicidal. I think oftentimes our emotional reactions, some people would say when we get triggered, can send us spiraling. And so I think the best way to approach it is we talk about focusing on responding and not reacting in order to make that assessment. And if we can't make that assessment ourselves, asking someone who does know, but really stopping to say how much of this is emotion speaking and how much of this is a really close threat that needs to be acted on. That can be a little bit abstract, but I think that that's something that can apply in a number of different situations. But
I know if I go back to that moment I discussed when I got those foreclosure notices, we were scheduled to go to a good friend's 40th birthday party that night. I didn't want to go. My wife made us go. And what I found myself telling my best friends is that they said, how could you be so calm? You're about to lose your house. You have no money. You got 2 young kids. And I don't know where it came from, but I said, listen, I don't want to lose it. But if I did, I think I have the ability to recreate it. As long as I'm healthy and my family's healthy, I truly think if I had to, I could recreate it. Not that I want to. So I think sometimes ask ourselves in that fearful moment, what's the worst that could happen? Okay. So sometimes what we think is really worst, is not the worst. Sometimes it is. So I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about some other things. But in general, oftentimes when we're fearful, if we take a look at what is the worst that could happen. And then I think Charlie's point that he says very, very important is when we get into a crisis right away, most people, including myself, oftentimes react and try and fix it right away. Where when we sit back and respond and look at the choices, it becomes a longer term solution. We don't make the problem worse. Okay, we don't have a short-term solution. We try and find answers that get us out of the crisis longer term.
So yeah, so it's a combination of what's the worst that can happen, but also likelihood. So when I talk to someone, pardon?
Likelihood.
Likelihood.
So risk assessment.
Risk assessment. And so when I talk to someone who opens the conversation by saying, I want to die, I want to kill myself, that's obviously a jarring thing, but we kind of look through like, okay, is there a timeline? What's the plan? Are the means available? And taking in all that information, we have a risk assessment and we can kind of go from there. But the thing about risk assessments is there's nothing secure about it, right? You can make an accurate risk assessment and there's always a chance that something flips on a dime. It's really extreme when you're working with something like suicidal people, but business relationships, wherever it is, I think there's this desire of like, okay, how do we put it in the right box and make sure that this box is super secure? And as long as we live in the world, there is no answer that's going to make it secure. And so how can we do the best we can given what we have?
Got it. That makes sense. And we have two questions right now in the queue. One deals with, so let's say there's a thinking, an established thinking that talks about, okay, you know what, in this kind of situation, you don't recover, whether it's a mental state or it's a situation that you're about to lose your house and somebody has influenced you to have that thinking. How do you recognize which external influences, which external beliefs are helpful to your growth or not? How do you choose mentors? How do you choose which beliefs to follow? And how do you unlearn the beliefs that are not worthy, that they're not good enough, don't serve your happiness?
Yeah, well, I would say that we can be in a situation with horrible odds, but chances are there's been at least one person who has beaten those odds. And so I think when we look at whatever situation we're in, really looking at like, who are the people that have beaten the odds in this situation and how can I learn from them? And that's kind of like for the project I'm working on now, this documentary series, we know that when stories of completed suicide are shared in the media, oftentimes rates can go up depending on how we report on it. It can amplify that. But the reality is that for every one person that dies by suicide, 25 survive. There's 287 people that have seriously considered it and didn't follow through. And so the approach of what I'm doing right now is, there's all these success stories that we're not actually seeing. And it paints an inaccurate picture for those of us in the public to consume. It changes our beliefs to think that this is unsurvivable. And so really being able to adjust our perception, and in this case with the project I'm working on, lifting up the stories of those who've recovered, lifting up the stories of those people who've experienced hope. What we found in the research is that that actually can decrease the rate of suicide, but also if we think of inside a person, those different mechanisms, it can actually decrease someone's suicidality. It can change our belief system. So the narratives and the stories that we hold oftentimes create our reality. So I think a big question is, yes, let's focus, like make sure that we're aware of the risks and the threats that are out there. But as humans, we have a bias to focus on the negative. So creating more space for the positive can actually help adjust our perception and give us a better chance to get to where we want to go.
Now, one of the questions you posed in there was, how do you pick a mentor, things like that. You know, when I was young, my mother always said, if you want to be happy, learn from happy people. So my issue is really, if you want to be successful, learn from successful people. So you really want to, I mean, a lot of it's a gut feeling. You can't learn from somebody you don't trust. So a lot of it comes down to trust, but it really comes down to, you know, do you have a connection? Have they been successful at what you're trying to achieve? Okay, oftentimes people will mention things that they haven't achieved before. So, you know, that's really the real bottom line is I do think that, you know, there's no such thing as a bad mentor. You bring somebody in, it doesn't feel right, you stop. But looking for somebody with similar values that has good experience of what you want to achieve.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. One other question we have is, when people around you are going through crisis, like what we're seeing right now in different ways in our society throughout this year, what are the best ways to help provide value? What are the best ways to help calm them, help them take productive, useful steps? What are the best ways for them to deal with the situation?
Yeah, so I would say one big piece is just being able to, some people would call it hold space, but essentially just be able to listen. Oftentimes we're in a very like fix it type of culture. And so we'll think that as someone's talking, like, let me give you all the answers to make it better. A lot of the times, so much help can happen by just being able to listen and have someone have a place to vent. Now, from there, we can do a bunch of other steps, but if we try to jump directly into fixing when someone just wants to be heard, we're not being very helpful. And also, like, listening is for some people, listening is very easy. I won't say for everyone, but I'm teasing. But you know, you don't have to be a trained psychologist to be able to listen well to someone. And so one is just listening and acknowledging and validating can make a wild amount of difference. And then also recognizing that, you know, I could give a bunch of different tips here, and I'm happy to do a couple of those, but sometimes we're not the right person to come up with a solution. And so one of the things that we can do is try and listen and understand what that person's need is. And if we're not the right person to come up with the answers, try and go find the person who is. And so being able to recognize when it's more useful to be a connector than to directly like be working with someone. But if we're, I guess, is there a more specific question?
Well, let me address a little bit. Let me address a little bit. I think first step is not to take responsibility for somebody else's crisis. Okay, so when someone has a crisis, we can help support them by making sure they know we care about them, and then by the questions we ask. That's what mentorship is. Mentorship is not giving answers. Mentorship is about asking the right questions. And I think many times people get in a crisis, they get blinded. They only see certain things. And so by taking a look and asking the right questions and helping them see other choices, knowing that we care and love about them, and no matter what happens, we'll be there for them. That's the type of thing that, you know, without getting specifics, because so oftentimes we don't have the expertise in other people's crises. And in essence, to tell you the truth, we really don't know their crisis. We know what they tell us. So the issue is really be there for them, love them, reach out to them, call them multiple times so they know you're there. And then ask them the right questions that really make them think about how to get out of it so they find their own way out. We shine a light on a path. They have to take the path.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So the next one we had was, if you're educated with high level of fear, how can you slow down in situations such as the one right now with COVID-19? How can you best slow down to assess when you're feeling pressure, when you're feeling anxiety, when you're feeling that things are hectic? How do you slow down?
So I'm not a schooled psychologist or things like that. Okay, but I tell you, most of that fear, as I said before, is in the future. So the real issue is we look at crisis as an opportunity. Okay, there are so many things changing. I know a good example of a friend of mine was mentoring some convenience stores, and they were getting ready to shut down and lay everybody off. And he says, "What are you doing? You need to be hiring." They said, "Why would you hire?" He said, "Look at your customers. You need to change to a necessity store. Go hire Uber and Lyft drivers, deliver necessities to your customers. That's what they need." So the issue really is, in every crisis, there's opportunity looming. The question is, start at the customer. Okay, I'm not talking personally now. This is a business side. Okay, but what are your customers going to need? What can you provide? Okay, and accept the things that you can't change, and just do the best you can do.
Yeah, and I would say on the personal level of like when we're feeling I need to slow down, my system is too overwhelmed, I can't really assess and do all of these things. A, that's understandable. But B, what I kind of hear behind that, if that's possibly where that's going, is this experience of feeling like we're spiraling. Like when big stresses come, that there's this sense of spiral. And so one of the things,
It's getting worse and worse. Fast.
Yeah, anxiety builds on itself,
Yes.
and crisis really can bring that out in so many of us. And so one of the most helpful things is looking at how do we knock that spiral off its tracks. We're not going to make everything picture perfect fine, but how do we get that spiral to stop going out of control? And there's a lot of really simple tools and techniques that we can use to do that. And it's different for different people. So a lot of times one of the terms that we use is finding an anchor. So some people find that in like really slow breathing, which can, to some people, sounds kind of woo-woo, like you do it in yoga or meditation, but it's also used in the military. There's this really sort of funny story.
Yeah, it works. It's slow. Can slow your pulse down, right? And then
Yeah, there's physiological benefits, but it was a funny story from Brene Brown, who's a shame researcher and very well known in that space, where she sort of was like, oh, the yoga teacher woo-woo, like 5, like breathe in for 5, hold for 5, breathe out. And then she talked to people in the military, some of like the top military like teams that are in these high stress environments. And she said, what do you do to calm yourself down? And they go, oh, well, we have tactical breathing. And she was like, what's that? And they go, no, you breathe in for 5, you hold for 5, out for 5, hold for 5. And so it's the same tool, but when we hear it from different sources, it sounds quite different. So that's one thing, but there's a number of different ones, right? Like we can sometimes taking a shower, disconnecting from something. If someone likes playing music, something that takes us out of our mind and kind of into our body or whatever we're doing. If we have little kids around, that can be a really good one. They demand our attention whether we like it or not sometimes. And if it's really extreme,
especially during a crisis, as I know from friends who have kids.
Yeah. And one other thing, if you're in like a very extreme state, so if you're feeling almost like there is an anxiety attack coming on, one thing that's been really helpful and is really simple is actually just like taking an ice cube and popping it in your mouth. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is it's a shock to the system.
Yes.
But it causes you to salivate, which is, in addition to lowering your blood pressure and your heartbeat, one of those things that is the body being in rest will do that. And so sometimes we try and think our way into calm, and that's not really the answer. Sometimes by tricking our body to physiologically moving towards calm, can actually allow the thinking to follow suit. So the thinking and the feeling, or like the physical and the mental, can be partners. They can work together or separately.
And the people who haven't learned, I mean, take meditation. It doesn't make things go away, but for the 15 minutes you're meditating, the breathing slows down, everything slows down, the mind slows down. It's just a tool. It's creating healthy habits. Okay.
Yeah, and I would say, there's there's many different types of meditation. And so for some people, if you're in a really heightened state of anxiety, sitting down and closing your eyes is not going to be helpful. You'll spiral more. And that's an example where using something like walking meditation or counting beads, or something that isn't saying mind, just be quiet, but saying mind, we're going to focus you on one thing.
And that is
And
a relatively simple thing, and a thing that's devoid of the potentially anxious thoughts, right, that were there before.
so yeah, it's meeting you where you're at and not just trying to find a cookie cutter solution, but really assessing where am I at and how can I use that assessment to find the best tools for me.
Mm,
Sometimes we have that answer, sometimes we have to ask someone to help us get that answer.
makes sense. And from my perspective, also sleep and regular exercise. Not overstraining exercise, but good sort of
Sure.
motivating and exercise that helps you feel refreshed.
Eat well,
Absolutely.
sleep well, exercise, right?
Agreed. Agreed. A question we have here on collecting feedback about yourself and your business from your trusted family and friends. What do you think about that? How helpful is that to ask people you trust in creating a pivot? We talked a little bit about that earlier. The second question to that is, how do you assess to what degree to rely on it, right? So here you have a group of experts around you, people whom you trust, who you think you have your best interests at heart. You ask them questions, they provide you feedback. What do you do with that? How do you process it? Do you take all of it, 80%? How do you evaluate?
Well, in our family, you get feedback whether you want it or not.
Right, right. Good.
Well, I think it's dangerous. I mean, I think you take it in for what it's worth. But the bottom line is, if they're actively involved in business, like they were in my business originally, that's one thing. But if they're actively, the bottom line is the customer has all of our answers. That's the feedback we need. The people that used to work for me would ask me what I thought about a product, and I said, I don't know. Don't ask me. Ask the customer. It doesn't make a difference what I think. So the real issue is, we all, to be successful in business, we need to become customer experts. We need to get their feedback on a regular basis. I used to tease our salespeople saying, hey, pretend the customer has all my money. Give them what they want and they'll give me all my money back. So it's really about, I can't emphasize enough the need for customer feedback, starting from the future customer needs and working our way back. That's how we evaluate. Now, there are times where family can help. I talk about my business with my kids, my wife. I get their input and things like that. But even I have a YPO forum, a dozen buddies who are really, really close, know me inside out. But in the hardest times, they gave me the worst advice. They told me to shut down SafeSkin. Okay, I'll never make it. Right? I said thank you. And then when I did it anyhow.
Well, and I would also say, there's feedback around our business operations, our organization, and also feedback about ourselves. And I'm not sure which the question was referring to.
I think it was both.
Yeah, and so I think if we're looking at feedback about ourselves, it's super useful to get feedback from a lot of different arenas. But I think treating it almost like an empirical, like a scientist, saying like, okay, let me look at these data points, because the danger is that the way our brains operate is we'll get a bunch of feedback. Oftentimes we can get 6 great comments, we get 1 bad comment. All we remember is the 1 bad comment. And not that that doesn't have use and that we shouldn't look at it. Absolutely we should. But I would say that recognizing that it's very easy for us to amplify certain bits of information. So when we take in that feedback, being able to try and look at it as objectively as possible, or getting someone else to look at it with you, can be a helpful way of creating some objectivity if we're so triggered by it. So taking that in, looking at it, and I would say especially looking for patterns. Like you can have one person who gives some feedback that's really out there and completely unrelated to what everyone else says. Listen to it, but that doesn't have nearly the same weight as if there's a piece of feedback that in some way, shape, or form is being said in multiple different places. If it's said in multiple places and that's showing that pattern, that really, I think, has a lot more power than a one-off.
And they're points of light and not the answer.
Makes sense. That does make sense. And this is, okay. Can we provide a link to the website? Absolutely. Let me type that in. So this is crisis
Into success.
into success.com. Yeah. Richard and Charlie, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for staying back and answering more questions. From my perspective, I really enjoyed our time together and the learnings. And I think it's been helpful to folks on the call to learn some of the things that you've learned that helped go from effectively from a possible death to life, to helping lots of people prevail and prevail and succeed in their recoveries and in their journeys. And then from a possible bankruptcy and a zero to exiting 2 businesses for in aggregate about 900 million. And that's in 1985 and 2000 kind of dollars. So thank you again on the behalf of myself, the HBS Club of Toronto, and the folks on this call.
Oh, it's been absolutely our pleasure. And I would say, life has definitely not been boring on our ends.
No, and we appreciate the time to share with you. Go Raptors, okay? And please feel free to reach out to us anytime you need us.
Thank you. And folks, one more time, Turning Crisis into Success, Audible, ebook, paperback, and crisisintosuccess.com. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Enjoy.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.